Let's start with a quote that I think perfectly captures the architectural blueprint of one of the world's most complex democracies. Scholar Ivor Jennings once observed, India is a federation with strong centralizing tendency. Basically, from day one, India's political system was built to have this massive, heavy anchor right at the top. But like any gigantic structure, right? Time, pressure, and the sheer number of people living inside it eventually start to test those boundaries.
So that actually brings us to the core tension of this explainer. What exactly happens when that massive central anchor starts to lift? Like what happens when a country of over 1 billion people decides that local voices need just as much volume as the national megaphone? Well, we are looking at a fascinating, decades-long tug-of-war between centralized authority and local autonomy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to our explainer on the pendulum of power, India's federal tug-of-war. Today, we are completely decoding the historical shifts, the constitutional updates, and the real-world political drama that completely transformed how power is distributed in India. Here is our quick roadmap for today. Number 1, the era of central dominance. 2, the rise of regional power. 3, power to the villages. 4, the need for a strong center. And finally, number 5, the modern balancing act.
Starting off with Part 1, Era of Central Dominance, the Early Decades.
To really get this shift, we have to look at the baseline, a time when the pendulum of power was swung almost entirely toward the very top. Between 1951 and 1967, Indian politics was entirely defined by one-party dominance. The Congress Party basically held all the reins both at the center and in almost every single state. The source material points out that back then, if disgruntled state chief ministers complained about the high-handedness of the center, well, the party high command just snapped them right back into line. But by the late 1960s, you start seeing some cracks. Regional political parties began to emerge triumphant in several states, and then, by the watershed elections of 1989, that era of total centralized political dominance completely shattered, ushering in this incredibly complex era of coalition politics.
Which brings us to Part 2, Rise of Regional Power, the states' pushback. As that political monopoly broke apart, the states really started pushing back. And this shift literally changed the entire political landscape. Suddenly, you had these massive national parties, like Congress and the BJP, who were operating on broad all-India priorities, but they just couldn't secure majorities on their own anymore. So what did they do? They had to start courting regional parties. We're talking about groups like the DMK, the Akali Dal, the TDP, and the Shiv Sena. Now, these regional parties, they didn't really care about some broad national image. They were fiercely focused on state-specific local issues, just trying to satisfy their immediate electorate.
And let me tell you, this gave the states incredible bargaining power. National parties had to essentially appease these regional leaders just to keep their coalition governments from completely collapsing. For instance, the source highlights this wild moment where the Trinamool Congress successfully demanded the bifurcation of railways in the western sector, literally just as a condition for their partnership in the NDA government. Plus, if we look at the economic liberalization in 1991, the central government wasn't handing out all the industrial licenses anymore. Suddenly, states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu were bypassing the center entirely and negotiating directly with foreign investors. The states were really starting to flex their muscles here.
Moving on to Part 3, Power to the Villages, the Grassroots Revolution. Now, the devolution of power didn't just stop at the state capitals. It swung all the way down to the local level, building an entirely new tier of governance. Back in 1992, the Narasimha Rao government passed the absolutely historic 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments. This gave true constitutional status to the Panchayati Raj, creating this really elegant three-tier system. It starts at the village level with the Gram Panchayat, moves up to the intermediate level, and finally reaches the district level with the Zilla Parishad. India effectively handed real democratic power straight to the grassroots.
And the sheer scale of this is just breathtaking. Out of roughly 3 million members elected to these local bodies, 1 million of them are women. The amendments actually mandated that not less than 1/3 of the total seats be reserved for women, alongside proportionate reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So this wasn't just some administrative shift, it was a monumental demographic revolution. It brought previously marginalized voices directly to the decision-making table. Now, what's truly fascinating is that this wasn't just symbolic power. The Constitution actually added the 11th schedule, which handed over 29 specific, tangible areas of responsibility directly to the panchayats. We are talking about the management of agriculture, minor irrigation, rural housing, drinking water, health, sanitation, education, and even women and child development. The actual resources and the responsibilities were handed directly to the people living in those specific communities. To truly grasp how powerful these local bodies have become, consider this amazing detail from the source. Today, even multinational giants like Coca-Cola and Pepsi have had to actively seek the consent of local village panchayats before opening bottling plants in Kerala. The panchayats can literally demand that these global industries help conserve the local ecology. I mean, having the authority to check the power of a massive global corporation right from a local village council, that is something completely unique in the history of center-state relations.
Let's pivot to part 4, need for strong center. The pendulum swings back.
However, as we all know, every action has a reaction. As much as decentralization is celebrated, in a heavily multi-religious, multilingual, and multi-ethnic country like India, a complete dissolution of central power just isn't viable. A strong central authority is still fiercely needed to manage the kinds of crises that states either cannot or will not handle. The central government plays this absolutely critical role in mitigating acute regional economic disparities and, crucially, protecting minority groups. The source neutrally points to some catastrophic events to really underscore this necessity. It specifically notes the aftermath of the Babri Masjid demolition in 1992, where the center actually dismissed the UP state government to stop the violence, and the 2002 Gujarat riots. These are framed as instances that violently underscore the acute need for central intervention when state machinery fails to control fanaticism or communal unrest.
And that brings us to Article 356, which you might know as President's Rule. This is essentially the ultimate centralizing tool. It allows the central government to dismiss a state government and just take direct control. Now, historically speaking, this was heavily misused. Back in the 70s and 80s, the ruling party at the center would routinely use it to topple opposition governments in the states for, well, purely political reasons. But today, largely because of that rise of regional power and coalition dynamics we talked about earlier, the center is far, far more cautious. It's treated much more as a tool of last resort, severely checked by accountability rather than just a casual political weapon.
And that leads us perfectly into part 5, the modern balancing act, accountability and coalitions.
So how exactly has this massive historical tug-of-war shaped the political ecosystem we see today? The crucial point here is the dramatic shift in actual governance results. In that pre-1980s era of pure central dictation, the result was very often severe bureaucratic red tape, nepotism, and pretty unchecked corruption at the top, kind of like what we saw in the license rush. But in the post-1992 era, which is really characterized by local and regional empowerment, the governance result has actually improved. By distributing power to regional coalitions and empowering those local panchayats, transparency has genuinely increased. You simply have more eyes on the resources now, and local leaders are much more directly accountable to the specific people they govern.
The source material ultimately summarizes this long, super complex journey on a really positive footnote. It states, states are no longer under the thumb rule of the center. The trend is certainly changing for the better. What was once a strict system of a boss dictating to their subordinates has really evolved into a true system of negotiation, bargaining, and mutual reliance.
And that leaves us with a pretty compelling question to carry forward. India's federal structure isn't just some static document sitting on a shelf, right? It's a living, breathing negotiation. So as the nation's economy continues to explode and new global and domestic crises inevitably emerge, how will this delicate tug-of-war between the center, the states, and the villages adapt next? Keep observing, folks, because this pendulum of power, it never truly stops swinging,